Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy EV Miniseries Episode 2. And with me, as always, is Niall, Riddell. Neil, welcome. How are you doing
Well,
today?
I am good, Chris. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. I'm excited to be doing this EV miniseries, and I'm really excited about our guest because as we set the baseline for EVs and we talk about what it means, I think we were really fortunate to get this guest on board, and he happens to be a colleague of yours. Tell us a little bit about him.
So, the gentleman we're about to speak to is someone who's a bit of an industry veteran, an industry legend. He's got a bit of history in this space because he's been through some of the journey that we're living as we go on our energy transition. The gentleman I'm talking about, I first met when I took an opportunity to travel with him up to Fully Charged Live. He publicly stated, "Would anyone like a lift in his Tesla?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I would." So we're speaking today to Graeme Cooper from National Grid. And we're talking about the energy transition and where the electricity system fits within that. So, do you want to say hello, Graham?
Hi, guys. Thank you for
Hey,
inviting.
Graham. Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
And Graham, I have a question that I like to ask a lot of our guests when they join, which is, a bit about your background. We get a lot of listeners who are curious about who it is we speak to and how they got there. Is there any chance you can tell us a bit about your background before National Grid?
Yeah. It's an accident of history more than anything else. There was no career plan. But look, I graduated from university. I'm a civil engineer by training. But when I graduated, we were in the 90s recession, right? So that makes me really old. But what was really exploding was the mobile, the cellular phone industry. We were going from really early stuff to kind of we were doing 2G networks, right? So we were going from basic phones. But the best way to describe it, it was really disruptive, right? There was no instruction book. Nobody rolled out cellular networks before. It was move fast, break stuff, reinvent. So it was really chaotic. It was really disruptive. But after about, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years, it started to really mature. And I started to kind of think, okay, I'm ready for a change. So I started a family, got married, started a family, thought I needed a job with a bit more of an ethical interest. Kind of naively looked at wind turbines and went, hey, that's the same as a mobile phone mast, right? Big, tall, bit of concrete at the bottom, steel in the middle, bird blender on the top, right? So I thought, well, maybe transferable skills. So when monster.com, the job site first came on, I just put my CV up one day. 10 minutes later, I got a call for an interview. I went to work in the wind industry. So I then did 11 years in the wind industry when at the time it was kind of run by environmentalists, not by business people. It was early doors. But again, went through that 11 years in that business. I've built £500 million of the wind farms, right? 8 large-scale commercial wind farms, all onshore, and I developed an offshore wind farm. But hey, once you've delivered your 8th wind farm, you're kind of like, well, it's a bit same old, same old. I've done that before. So I was looking at where's the next big disruptor? And of course, the next big disruptor was decarbonising transport. And I'm a real car lover, right? I'm a petrol head. Borrowed an EV and it completely changed my world. So, when I look across those 3 sectors, what are the standout things, right? They're technology disruptors. They're pushed by government. They're pulled by consumer. They all have significant infrastructure and they all have a strong regulator. So the one golden thread that runs across all of those are those 5 critical items. So yeah, it's been a wild ride.
So, are EVs really being driven by consumers? Are consumers lining up for EVs?
So in the UK today, if you order an EV, you're probably going to be waiting 9, 10, 11, maybe even 12 months for it. The biggest challenge right now is they can't make enough and ship enough into the UK. So this is definitely a seller's market.
So now we've got all these electric vehicles emerging on the market and people want them and they're going to put them at their houses. We're going to see quite a significant surge in demand for power at people's houses across the country at different locations. And the question that you must get asked all the time is, can the grid handle it?
Yeah. And there's the thing with these things is you can just do the throwaway comment, which is yes, right? But that's not really helpful, is it? Gives no context. But let me give you 2 lenses on this. So bearing in mind the energy infrastructure is mission critical for any economy, we can't not be ready. Yeah? It has to cope, right? That's one lens you can put on this. And Chris, I know you're probably going to challenge me with a whole bunch of questions, but we'll go there in a minute. But at the same time, I want to give it some context, right? So on the journey to net zero, the UK as an economy is going to use at least twice the amount of energy by 2050 than we do today. To be able to do that, we're going to need at least 4 times the amount than we have today of clean generation. And consequently, that means we will need twice the grid capacity. But let me give you some context. So you know that doubling of demand, so that 100% growth in demand, decarbonising transport is only 15 to 20% of that new demand. Yeah? Decarbonising heat's actually more troubling because that's 50 to 60% of the new demand. Okay? So when people say to me, yeah, will the grid cope? Yes, it's going to change, but it will cope.
So, is there the investment for that going on right now? So, when we first had our first conversation, the economy was still slightly rosier than it is today. And if I look at even, recent UK announcements of, windfall taxes and all this other stuff that's happening because of where we are going into this winter, um, doesn't that impact that nice, rosy, yes, we can do it picture?
No, not really. This is long-term investment. Look, so the current energy crunch, right, is a 2, 3, 4 year thing, right? Even if you look at this being the longest recession on UK record, they're saying we'll be done in 7 or 8 years, right? So it's a bit like puppies, right? Puppies are not for Christmas; they're for a lifetime, right? Investing in grid infrastructure and big generation is a generational thing. So an offshore wind farm is good for 25 to 30 years, right? It takes you 10 years to build it. So when I reflect on, I guess, the framing of your question, yes, people will look at the energy policy environment, they'll look at the economic environment, and they'll make an assessment. But we need clean energy. People are going to need it for a long time. The growth is there. The need to clean it. The energy security piece is there. And the need to drive cost out. At the moment, gas is setting the price. It's a global scarce economy. And in the UK, we're blessed with one of the best resources in Europe, right? The best wind resources in Europe, which is why we're going to get, by 2030, probably just after, to at least 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. Now, 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is going to arrive in the next 7 years, is more than enough clean power to decarbonise all road transport in the UK. Now, other things are changing, but there's more than enough power coming.
And so the power perhaps is coming for EVs, and you said it's 15%, give or take, use
15 to 20% of new demand by
of
2050.
new demand. But I guess if I look at that, and Neil talked about in the opening about riding in your Tesla, but if everybody were to have a charger in their neighborhood, and we all get these great new EVs, are we really ready for that infrastructure? Is the grid going to handle that? So let's assume you get your wind, you get the capacity generation somewhere, somehow. Um, but if all my neighbors buy fancy new EVs, that's a whole lot of charging going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, firstly, often when people ask the question around will the grid cope, they do well, if everybody had an EV tomorrow and everybody plugged in at 6 o'clock and charged, then there won't be enough power. Yeah, that's great. So where are all these cars going to suddenly arrive like that, right? So this is a transition, not a cliff edge. But a lot of people staring at the EV challenge think that the change in the power system starts today. Suddenly we're going to go for EVs, right? Well, it doesn't happen suddenly, it's a transition. But also the energy grid has been changing for the last 20 years. It's the one thing that grid networks always do. So we've gone from large centrally driven power stations, mainly coal, some gas, right? Nuclear as well. We've now almost got no coal on the system. The last coal power station will be off the bars in the next 18 months, 2 years. We've gone from a grid that was very dirty. In the UK, we're now in a situation where more power is made from clean sources than by burning stuff. And that means the grid networks, instead of being like a spokes of a wheel, generation in the middle, power going out, we now have power stations in the sea, on the periphery of the country, moving power in. So the grid has been forever changing. Give you an idea of how that's changing, right? To get to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, National Grid as a business is going to spend 17 billion pounds on building wires onshore to bring that offshore wind into the grid. Now, that scale of investment, right? We're going to spend in the next 7 years more money on wires than we have in the last 32 years. So it's not a sudden change. This is transitional. But the other challenge that you look at is we've had a power system where generation had had to turn up and turn down to match consumers. The beautiful thing about having an EV is its movable demand. I don't mean movable as in 4 rubber tyres you can move it, but when you charge it, can move. And that means you can do a whole lot of smoothing. You can make charge cars when the grid is clean and cheap. You can pause chargers when the grid is expensive and dirty. So actually, they bring as much of a solution as they do bring a problem.
So we talked a little bit about the history of how we ended up with our electricity system. But are we safe to look backwards in order to understand what might happen next? I mean, there's a huge section of questions we just don't know the answer to yet. What can we learn from history? What should we take from history? And how might things be different in the future?
Okay, so let's look. If we look backwards, I always think sometimes backwards is a really poor metric to look forwards, right? So let's look at the way grid networks have been built in the past, right? Grid networks generally react to demand or generation. After the event, we build capacity. In the past, we've had to build it to peak plus headroom. What's the worst, and build it to that. But if you think of how generation has changed over time, long history, it would take you, it takes you 10 years to build a nuclear power station, right? And then it'll run for 40. It takes you 7 or 8 years to build a wind farm, and then it'll run for 30, right? So long lead time items, slow transition, right? It's all, gently. But if we look at the looking forward from here, how quickly did we go to VHS videos, to mini disc players, to iPods, to smartphones, right? These are hockey stick uptakes, right? Or S-curves. Hang on. Building grid networks is quite linear, right? Doesn't do hockey stick. So the work that's going in from a grid networks perspective is, how do we start building now to build just enough grid capacity, just in time for those hockey stick uptakes? But what we've got that's really neat is actually smart and managed buys us space to do that, right? So there are those in the energy sector who go, don't build any wires, just do smart. That buys you some time. There are those in the energy sector who go, no, don't do smart, just build wires. And they're quite tribal, but actually you need both. Smart management of consumption, right, buys time for grid networks to do big lumpy investment. But then conversely, when you've done the big lumpy investment, don't build dumb to peak plus headroom like the worst. Build with smart optimization built in, that grid smoothing. Because what you then do is you get a bigger grid that's just big enough. You get it optimized because ultimately the cost of the grid is shared across everybody who uses energy. So you want it to be really well utilized. So actually, looking forward, looking to smart tech, smart demand side management will actually help us manage that transition. And remember, this is not a cliff edge, right?
So you're speaking from someone that is a grid person. Your expertise tends to be grid. Your profession tends to be grid. So are EVs just storage that happens to move people around, or are they transformative transportation for all of us?
So the answer is yes and yes. So look, I've got a background in energy. I've been in energy 20 years. I've built wind farms, right? I've got an MBA in energy, weirdly, right? So I've even studied this in further education. But what I really love about the debate around, are cars just great storage, right? Or are they transformative transport? Well, 2 things. Firstly, if we just swap every gas car today, petrol or diesel car today, for an electric car, we will have failed, right? Because congestion is going to be the same, right? A traffic jam of electric cars or a traffic jam of petrol or diesel cars is the same traffic jam. So firstly, we need to be clever about how we move, travel less, do more active travel, more shared, more, urban mobility. And then, fine. If you have to travel with a personal car, make it electric. So that's the first point I want to land. But I also think we need to be really careful about just assuming that there's one lens on these things. So I'm a bit, I run hot and cold on things like vehicle to grid, right? So our car's just storage. Because the engineer in me, and I see engineers every day who work for National Grid, they do the really engineering thing, which is if you've got this much storage on the road, right, and you can plug it in, that'll be the equivalent of a power station. So they assume that good engineering fixes everything. And I get that, right? From an engineering level, it's really logical. And you say, well, you could save some grid cost and you could save some power stations, be really, really smart. Then they get an economist to say, if you could do that, would it work, right? And then an economist will go, we can put numbers against that. Yeah, it might be affordable to do vehicle to grid and, put power in and out of cars. So they're part of the solution. But what both engineers and economists forget is user behavior, right? So I've been an EV driver since 2017. And my car has about 200-mile range. So I plug it in once a week. So if it's only plugged in once a week, it's only useful to the grid once a week. And then the other thing is, I was called out at a conference recently. There was a guy in the front row and he said, vehicle to grid won't work, Mr. Cooper, and I'll tell you why. And I said, well, okay, why will it not work? He said, when would the grid most likely need power out of car batteries? And I said, well, evening peak today is between about 5:30 and 7:30 in the night, right? And he turned around and said, I'm a traffic modeler. That's what I do. I manage traffic. Ask me when are cars most used? I said, well, go on. When are cars most used? And he said, well, funnily enough, between 5:30 and 7:30 on a night. So when I think about the ability for the car to be like the grid savior and vehicle to grid being an answer, I run a bit hot and cold because I think it needs a couple of other things to come together. The behavioral piece to be understood, how you can value it. Now, I'm not saying it'll never be there, but also I'm not saying that it's some sort of golden answer to the challenge. So I think we get a long way with just managed charging. Vehicle to grid may or may not be really important as we go forward.
I love the topic of vehicle to grid, and I think we'll end up having a separate session entirely on that topic. But you mentioned something that really piqued my curiosity there about the linearity of grid rollout and the hockey stick uptake of new technologies. Where do you think we are on the hockey stick? Are we at the bottom of the curve? Are we approaching the bottom of the curve? Are we on the upward slope? I always spend a lot of time.
Yeah, firstly, look, we're talking about EVs. So we're in the UK, we're really on that. It's visible. The hockey stick is visible, right? Last year, 14% of all new car sales in the UK were fully electric. We are even conservatively estimating 21% of all new car sales in the UK are fully electric, right? And we know that you're not going to be able to sell a car with only petrol or diesel engine by 2030, right? So the writing's on the wall. So that hockey stick from an EV perspective is already visible. We're still early adopters, right? So if you're an EV driver today, you are still in the 2 and a bit % of cars on the road. But very quickly, I talk to people today and they kind of go, oh, another EV. Whereas before they were a rarity, you start to see them around. We're normalizing an EV, right? But what I wanted to bring into here is, don't forget, if 15 to 20% of the uptake in energy demand is EVs, decarbonising heat, largely through heat pumps, is 2, 3, 4 years behind. But that's 50 to 60% of the demand, right, as we go forward by 2050, right? So coming back to your question, Neil, yes, we can see the hockey stick uptake, the S-curve going for EVs. We can't really see it yet for heat pumps. But what's really interesting is when I talk to the guys at National Grid Distribution, right? So they're the last mile into homes, they can already start to detect double clustering, right? So the most likely person to put a heat pump in their home owns an EV. And there is where it starts to get really interesting, because an EV will double the typical electricity consumption of a home. And then you add a heat pump, and you're then not doubling it again, but it's another 50% demand on a home.
So I'll buy your argument that someone's an EV user probably cares more about it and will probably get to the double clustering, and that will happen. So I buy that all day long. One thing that, having also lived through the tech bubble and Moore's Law and all the great things that happen with technology and the economies of scale, we got laser discs and all the great stuff we got. The difference is in technology. If you look at how autos are made and the kind of plants and the investment of tooling a plant for an auto is very different than a consumer electronic. So I don't totally buy your argument on the pace, because right now it's early movers. You got the Teslas, you got, Volvo's announcing their big SUV is going to be electric now by 2030 or whatever. You get all this stuff happening. But once you've retooled and changed these plants, there's fewer auto manufacturers in the world that have large tooled plants. So I would argue you will hit a tipping point based on my limited knowledge. We're just starting the mini series, but just hearing what you just said and listening and thinking about that, I go, I don't know that I buy what you just told me.
So, Chris, I love the challenge, right? The fact that we're grown-ups and we can have a debate, right, is really good, right? Because I'm the energy guy, not the automotive guy. But that thing around hockey stick and that uptick, when I look at the car park of the past, premium German stuff, some run-of-the-mill, middle-of-the-road stuff, but all produced across Europe. What I'm really seeing grow very quickly now is the stuff that's made in markets that we've not seen before, right? So we're seeing MGs with bigger range, with as many toys on it, premium stuff, and cheaper. So I know where you're going with it. Cars are not a premium good, right? They're not a fast-moving consumer good, but I think they could be. And don't forget, we've got that strange global phenomenon right now that actually car production almost stalled across the planet because of COVID and the shortage of silicon chips, right? So there are a lot of cars with a lot of aging fleet. So as the product comes through, I think they could refresh quite quickly. So I don't think it will be as quite a steep a hockey stick uptake, right, as a latest iPhone. But I think it's going to move faster than automotive has ever seen move before.
So I'd like to come back to your double clustering point and the local implications. We see already that electric vehicles are more expensive than conventional vehicles. Therefore, they're getting bought by certain types of people. They're getting used in certain locations. Do we see really localized impacts happening? So that it's great that the grid is preparing with these really big investment plans, but is enough being done at the street level? Will my street black out because everyone on my street buys an electric vehicle? What does this mean for rural areas? What can you tell us about the distribution networks?
Yeah, so don't forget, I work for National Grid Electricity Transmission, right? So I'm the big power, the big wires you see, the big substations, 400,000 volts, 275,000 volts, right? The stuff that really runs the country. But National Grid as a business bought Western Power Distribution, which is now called National Grid Electricity Distribution, which is the biggest distribution business in the UK. And, part of that process, we get really interesting discussions. So don't forget, when you look at the consumption of a house, it's going to go up with the growth of EVs and heat pumps, as you say. But also, there's something here about, I mentioned before about EVs bring the problem, but they bring as much of a solution. So in the same way, you can turn a car to charge on or to pause a charge when big generation, there's plentiful or there's scarcity. But you can also do that because of the capacity of the wires. So it is fairly likely that most homes will have to have an upgrade to their grid connection in time. But not everybody all at the same time. And technology actually helps, delay that or gives us some space to do that, right? So in the same way, you wouldn't want the car charging at the same time as heating your home and running your oven and pulling a bath, right? But because more of the devices are getting more connected, you could actually see that the technology could pause an EV when the oven goes on, right? You don't heat your home overnight. So you could pause the car whilst you're in the evening and you want the heat. but the car would start charging when the heat pump goes off after you've gone to sleep. So you can actually see how we can see some technology will actually help buy some space and time and flexibility to allow the upgrade to the grid. But there's also something happening more locally. So normally the energy market is managed by National Grid's electricity system operator, the big control room that happens to be down the road from me here. But what you actually see now is local markets. So the distribution businesses now have a thing called the distribution system operator, trying to manage local supply and local demand and local implications on the local network. So you might find in time that actually they might want to buy services from a consumer, right? To ask them to pause their EV and pay them to do so, to buy space for the grid to be upgraded. So I think that the thing that we think about here is a lot of people think that nothing's changing, just cars. Nothing's changing, just heat pumps. No, there's innovation happening at grid, business model innovation, technology innovation, funding innovation, even democratizing energy, right? I mean, that's something we ought to pick up, Neil. I mean, we were discussing this offline the other day, right? Everybody who is a consumer of energy has had it done to them, right? For their lifetime. You buy a house or you're in a house, you register for the meter and you just get a bill. And it's a page of numbers you just simply don't understand, right? And then at the end of it, there's a pain point. You have to send money so the lights stay on. But what having an EV tells you is, even somebody who spent 20 years in energy, I learned more about energy in the first 4 hours of owning an EV than I probably learned in 20 years in the energy sector, right? Because when I thought about a kilowatt, what did that mean? It was just a number. I mean, energy is really strange. Electricity is really strange, right? You can't smell it, touch it, see it, taste it. Or if you do touch it, it's probably the last thing you do. But do you know what I mean? It's a really strange commodity, right? You don't really see where you waste it. It's invisible. But what I learned in the first 4 hours of owning an EV is 250 kilowatts meant nothing until you do 0 to 60 miles an hour in 4.6 seconds. So suddenly you have an emotional understanding, right? That firing into the seat. So you now know what 250 kilowatts means. It has a direct reference to you. And more conversely, my Tesla that I took to Neil to fully charge it had a 75 kilowatt hour battery. So call that roughly 200 miles. So I know that my home uses about, in 4 days, 200 miles of range, right? So 50 miles a day. So all of a sudden, energy to me is now the throw in the back of the seat tells me the power, right? And the kilowatt hours tells me how much my home uses in distance from home, right? So when you know that, you then ask good questions. So you see on all the EV forums, right? People buy an EV and they go, yeah, I bought a Tesla or an iPace. The first thing they say is, damn, what charger do I get? People then pile in, right? With, do I need a smart one or a dumb one? Yeah, do I need one with an app or one you program? Right. And then people go down the route of saying, well, I'm using a lot more energy, so can I get a smart tariff? And then before you know it, even with a smart tariff, people say, well, can I generate my own? They put solar on the roof. And then they go through the piece where they go, well, hang on, the sun's shining, but my car's with me at work. Can I get a battery? So what we're seeing in all of that ecosystem, and you can pick this up again, is what we're seeing is democratization of energy. If you want to participate, you can. And by participating, it opens up all of this ecosystem.
So when you say democratization of energy, I would say for upper middle class people, you're absolutely correct. But if you don't have the resource, it's not very democratized at all, because not everybody can enjoy this, right?
Well, you see, that's a really good one. This is why we can have this grown-up discussion and debate, right? So with any technology, there's trickle down, right? So people in lower incomes will have to wait for second or third hand electric cars for them to participate, right? As the price curve goes. So not everybody benefits from a technology change all at one go. You remember when people had the first phones, these big brick things, right? Everybody thought it was just yuppies who could have one. Now, most of us have at least one. Even, right, one of the things that they say about people who are struggling with homelessness is most of them have a phone, right? Because it's a way of connecting with people. So there is that trickle down. But I also think the piece here is, yes, if you're a bit geeky and in the energy system like me, you're ready to engage in democratizing energy. But even I don't have the time to be geeky about it. I actually outsource the smart charging of my car to an app. I've been doing that since about 2018. It's so good that I can't even remember the password to log into the app to work out whether it's still doing it, right? So I think even as the technology trickles down to those who are not in the sort of upper middle class who are looking to participate now, you will find that the smart and democratization of energy, they will outsource it, right? It'll be, if they're in rental accommodation, it will be heat and light as a service, right? It'll be bundled with their rental. Now, the smart flexibility will happen. They just won't see it. But it's going to take time for this to flush through. I come back to the point. This is a transition, right? It's not a cliff edge. We really are at the bleeding leading edge of this transition, but that's why we're engaged in having the debate. No one knows all the answers. But I think that it will trickle down.
So one of the things you were talking about there that I thought was really interesting is, as National Grid, you are a centralized body with a kind of regulatory responsibility. But you also talked about the democratization of that and, placing power into the hands of people. And that journey means massive coordination and, lots of data flows, marketplaces, platforms, like you said, apps and algorithms to simplify this so we don't have to think about when we do these things. You must see some awesome innovation. What are some of the cool things that you're seeing these days?
Well, can I just tell you how fast this is changing? 12 years ago, I connected a transmission-connected wind farm, my biggest wind farm that I built. And I went into the control room at National Grid and said, "Hi, I'm new to this. This is my first foray into being a big wind farmer. How do I do this?" And they sat me down and they went, "Wind's not going to be really big, right? It's probably just a fad. Go hug a tree somewhere, chap, right? The grid's going to fall over at more than 4% renewables. Look where we are now, right? So look how fast and far we're coming." But that even then tells you something. So, working for National Grid a few years ago, turning up or turning down generation, because that's all you could do. You can't turn up and down demand. You can only turn up and down generation, is done through a big centralized balancing mechanism. But can I tell you what happened this week? So through innovation, a whole bunch of flexible demand side businesses aggregated enough volume of car chargers or people with smart meters, and they went to National Grid and said, "Look, instead of paying for a coal power station or a gas power station to generate more, why don't you ask us to use less," right? So the asymmetry, up until now, power stations have turned up and down to meet demand. Now we've got the smart opportunity for demand to turn up or down to meet generation. So they ran a pilot this week, right? And they said to people, opt in, and for that peak hour, would you turn some stuff off and we will reward you? So most people under the current price cap are paying about 38, 39p a kilowatt hour. They would pay people £2.50 for the same kilowatt hour to not use some energy. Now, that doesn't mean sitting in the dark with a candle, right? But just turn down things that you would not normally run. So we saw people pause chargers or pause heat pumps or just have their dinner a little earlier or a little later. And do you know what? Smart meters and that smart data aggregation proved to work. So in the world we're going forward now, even that trial, which, let's admit it, was small and targeted and was just a learning exercise, there are going to be 5 or 6 more of these across the winter. Every one is a learning exercise. And what it proves to me, or it gives me hope for, right, is the combination of the business model innovation, the technology innovation, the hardware innovation, but also being brave enough to try, is how by just a couple of years from now, 2025, National Grid will be able to run for the first time, and it will probably be only like 15, 20 minutes in the first days or so, fully clean. And we'll learn and we'll use all the tools in the toolbox that are developing. And then it'll be an hour, and then it'll be 2, and then we'll do a day fully green. We need to get the UK power system fully clean by 2035. So when people talk about net zero by 2050, I don't think 50, I'm thinking 35. And it's this innovation and these trials which will actually be the building blocks that enable that. So it's a really exciting place to be. And there's no such thing as a daft idea.
And what I love about what you've just said is we conventionally think of the grid as wires, but you're describing the marketplace and the systems that we need to really make this work. You've created this ecosystem which actually can support small generation. And you and I both remember, like you say, 5, 10, 15 years ago, it was unthought of that, batteries and distributed assets could provide these services. But it's fabulous to see it. There must be a cultural mind shift within the entity, the business as well, to enable this transition to happen. How's that happened? Who drove that? Where does it come from?
Oh, well, so like all these things, there's no one catalyst for this, right? So firstly, there is, and I have to call it out, top-down leadership, right? So the leaders of the big utilities are pushing the boundaries because they have to be relevant and credible and resilient for the future going forward. But at the same time, I'll call out people who are really pushing the boundaries. You've got the likes of Octopus Energy and OVO Energy really pushing the art of the possible. If they hadn't pushed, right, smart, clever, aggregated digital platforms to be able to do this, it wouldn't be possible. So I think there's an element here which is there's a huge push from the bottom up. There is a considered push from the top down. But also it's the convergency is where it gets really interesting. If you think about, our topic today is transport. Transport has never had to engage with the energy system. And the energy system has never had to engage with transport, right? But what we're seeing is that convergence of 3 industries, energy, transport, and digital. And they actually all have to converge simultaneously and play nice together for this actual transition to work. And we all sort of realize it. So often people do tokenism discussions around like collaboration. It's a lovely, fluffy word, but they'll do it in a meeting. And the minute they go outside is they're hammer and tongs against each other, right? Stab each other in the back. But what I'm seeing in this space is people collaborate in a meeting and then they go outside and keep collaborating. And then they have another idea and they bring it back to the next meeting. So there's an element of now that this sort of transition is now it started to grow organically. And you start to feel it and see it everywhere. And actually, even those who have all these myths, which the grid won't cope or you'll never do demand side management, they're actually busting their own myths, demonstrating the art of the possible. And that then gives confidence. More people pile in with brighter ideas, and it goes from there on in, right? And so it really feels like there's momentum.
So with the momentum, I mean, it sounds kind of grassroots the way you're describing it, but my understanding is the early moving, the movers of the needle today would be fleets first and then individual EVs. Is that where we are in this evolution? So are we seeing fleets widely deployed as EVs today, or is that still less than that 1% number you're seeing? Like where's that 1% made up of?
Yeah, so where we are today, we're a little over 2% of cars on the road. But when you look at the dynamics in the UK market of cars being bought and sold, is more than 50%. It's about 51% of all new car sales in the UK are company purchases, company cars. So what's really interesting for me is this is where you end up with like government intervention being quite clever. So if you are given a company car, you're taxed actually quite highly. It's a perk, but you're taxed accordingly. So it's a nice perk to have, and I have a company car, but you do lose through tax quite a lot. So what government thought really cleverly was, how do you get these very expensive electric cars to become half-price second-hand cars? So what they did is they took the benefit in kind, the tax you pay as a company car user, really low, down to zero. So what you found very quickly is they call them user choosers, right? People who have a car list can pick the car they want. If you realize if you picked an electric car, it's a bit like getting a pay rise. If you hand back a diesel car and then get an electric car, you get a cool car and you get more money in your monthly pay packet, right? So even those who were a little reluctant saw the overall benefit. But what that shows very quickly is that government policy means that those electric cars that flow into the company car pool, right, will flush through after 3 or 4 years into the second-hand market as half-price cars, allowing the second-hand market, the private user, to come along. But also the other benefit is through companies now having to report their emissions, right? Companies are saying, hang on, what are my emissions? Well, the dirtiest thing I do as a company is move people and goods. Well, hang on, if my people who are choosing company cars are choosing them because of the BIC rate, I can now report that the dirtiest thing I do is getting cleaner. So National Grid as a business, just in the UK, for our electricity business, we have just nearly 2,000 company cars. We now have an EV-only company car policy. So today we've got 917, right, electric cars on a company car fleet. The very first of those are now coming up for 3 years old and are just starting to flush into the second-hand market. So what you start to see is, again, I come back to my point, this is a transition, not a cliff edge. What we're seeing now is the first big flush of Tesla Model 3s are going into the second-hand market. Tesla Model 3s on the second-hand market have dropped thousands of pounds in the last month or two because the first flush through of those 3-year-old cars are hitting the market. So this is really flushing through, but companies are realizing they're getting loads of experience in that transition. And so we're sharing that knowledge with fleets that are not yet moved. And so this is all part of showing by doing, being able to report that you're doing the right thing for the climate. And we're learning loads from our drivers and we can share that with others. So, it's not right that we say everybody's got to be on this energy transition and then not do it ourselves. So we're showing by doing, which just gives us that element of credibility.
So one of the things I always like to ask towards at the end of these conversations is about your personal use. But I think you've taken us on this incredible journey from the grid is going to break to, no, it's okay. We've got to manage transition. And I'm quite excited hearing about the innovation journey you've been on. So the question I always like to close out these conversations on is, you drive an electric vehicle. What is it you drive? Why did you select it? What's some of your personal experience look like?
Yeah. So I live in a carbon neutral house. I didn't actually start, right, with an electric vehicle. So 11 years ago, I bought a really, really old rundown house. And I asked the question, how am I going to heat it? And the guy calculated the heat loss and said, you're not on the gas, you're going to have to heat it with oil. And it was just a frightening number. And I was going to have a van-size oil tank in the garden. So my journey actually started with a house. And I asked the difficult question, which is, how am I going to heat it? So my 600-year-old house is heated with 28 kilowatts of ground source heat pumps, right? But I was a petrol head. So I was a petrol head and loved cars, and it clashed with my clean house and it clashed with my working in the wind industry. And I just thought, this is not right? I'm doing the right thing at home, but I still have this unhealthy appetite for cars. So I borrowed a Nissan Leaf. The first early Nissan Leaf? They said, was it leading edge design? Some say it was ugly. Some say it was a look only a mother could love. But when you're in it, you don't see the outside. So I borrowed one for 4 days. Loved it, right? It changed my world. For me, it was that eureka moment. So I then went to work for National Grid doing this. And how about this for bizarre? When I started on my first day of National Grid, I said, right, what's my electric car? And the company car scheme says, no, we don't recognize electric cars. You have to have a hybrid, right? So the cleanest car I could get was a plug-in hybrid. So again, I thought, I can't be the electric car guy and drive just a hybrid. So I went off and I leased a Tesla Model S. So I did 3 years in a Tesla Model S, drove 45,000 miles in 3 years. I did it in off-peak electricity, smart charging. I ran that car for 45,000 miles at 2p a mile. I didn't need to service it. Cost me 4 tyres and a wiper blade, right, in 4 years. So I'm now into my second generation of car. So the Tesla went back. I'm now in a Mercedes EQC. Beautifully built car. I mean, you could argue that it's better built than the Tesla. But you know what? I do miss my Tesla because it's a better wrapped solution. But what it does mean is as a person, I buy clean electricity on a really dynamic tariff. I move all of my 72% of my demand happens off peak when the grid is cleanest and cheapest. I heat my home with ground source heat pumps. I drive an EV. I even treat all my own wastewater on site with a biodigester. So the only emission from my home is clean water. And so really for me, I see the big policy stuff, the big grid, and that trickling down. I'm the engaged consumer looking up, and actually the gap is narrowing for so many people that actually this is just a transition. And you know what? We're going to normalize this, right? At the moment, somebody will come and tell you, they kind of go, hey, man, I bought an electric car. And nobody says, what did you buy? What color is it? You know, what size wheels is it? They just go, yeah, electric car. But do you know what? I think in the next 7, maybe 8 years, people will kind of go, yeah, I bought a Volkswagen. And they'll go, great, a blue one or a green one, right? Because people will just assume it's electrically powered. And so I think for me, the most exciting thing is, when do we normalize some of these tech changes?
This is a fabulous conversation that we could continue all night. It's been a real pleasure to hear about your journey, the business's journey, and hopefully some real positivity for the future. So thank you ever so much, Graeme, for coming to join us.
No, thanks very much, guys.
And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed the second episode of our EV mini-series. We're just off in the beginning of this journey. Tune in, find out more. There's many episodes to come. If you like this, subscribe, follow us on the YouTube channel, and don't forget to comment. We'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.